In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Zodiac Aries, and let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. I, in general, prefer magenta over a red, and this one will become my birthday ink for the future. Don't write today down. Today is not my birthday, but I am an April baby. This shades nicely, and even from a gusher of a pen, but I have to be clear. I'm saying a gusher of the pen because of how well it's doing with the Himalaya and that flex nib. It looks so good here. It gives tone variation depending on the pen and the nib size that you choose, which I have come to enjoy even more when it comes to how inks perform. I even once, maybe a little bit more, saw some sheen, which is very evident. And most interesting is after it dried, it didn't smear all over the place, which is normally a reason I would not use sheen. Now, normally sheening inks are not for me, but the fact that this is not smearing is very nice. As expected with a Sailor ink, it is well behaved. And in general, it's fun to look at and really has personality on the page. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Fountain Pen Revolution Himalaya, their version 1 with the Fountain Pen Revolution Flex nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine has no feather, no spread. It's shading fairly nicely from this fine nib. We're getting a lot of it. If you look at the word gold, which will come at the end of it, you'll see a lot of it. Crown, different, ratios, all of them. Great shading throughout all of the writing. Now, the medium, much darker than the fine. Mostly what we're getting is the darker tone, and it is shading back towards the light, which is pretty interesting to see. We get a majority of darker tones, but it's a good mid-tone here. No feather and no spread. Perfectly good performance. The broad, much darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, some shading, but it's not really stand out to be any kind of a big deal here. But the most noticeable thing is the broad writing brought attention to some of the sheen that I'm seeing. And it was interesting because at first I thought I was seeing shade, but then it was sheen. And I looked back and I got to see some of that sheen actually in the medium as well as the fine. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, very nice. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Waterman graduate with a fine nib, a Pilot vanishing point with a medium nib, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. The fine has no feather, no spread, little bits of shading. I say little bits, it's definitely there if you look at the word it or the word he. It's in the word diagrams, but a lot of what we're getting here is much darker than we saw on the Clairfontaine, and that's because this is a much more absorbent paper. Now, the medium is a little bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, very little shading, almost none at all, really. The broad is darker than the medium, with no feather, no spread, absolutely no shading. And on this paper, we're not getting any kind of the sheen that we saw on the Clairefontaine. Now, that's because Clairefontaine is a coated paper. This is not, and this also is much more absorbent as a paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get a lot of ghosting, normal, but no bleed through, so doing very well. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. The fine has no feather, no spread, little bits of shading. It does have some. It's definitely there, not as standout on the last papers, but most certainly we're getting to see it. The medium is just a tad bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spreading. Still seeing some shading here, which is nice. It's coming here a little bit lighter in tone than on some of the other papers, which is allowing some of that shade to show through. The broad is darker than the medium, quite a bit darker than the medium, with no feather, no spread, so it's doing great on this paper. We're not getting any shading, and we're not getting any of the sheen that we saw on that Clairefontaine, really leading me to say Clairefontaine's probably the only one that's going to have it, but it is also the only paper in my writing samples that's coated. Looking at the back of the page, we have less ghosting than we had on the Leuchtterm, and it is not bleeding nearly as far in as we saw on the Leuchtterm. Being able to see them side by side, like here, you see that the Moleskine actually outperformed it. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. The fine has no feather, no spread. It is giving some shading in the writing. It's performing very nice on very cheap paper. Medium is the same tone as the fine, with no feather, no spread, still some very nice shading. The broad, much darker than the finer, the medium. No feather, no spread, no shading. But the thing is, to look at all of the writing, what you're going to really notice about it is it's much more red than on papers. A lot less of that magenta really looking here. It looks like I'm using a red ink. So I find that interesting that there's been some reaction with this paper that's causing it to really not look good. I don't like how this looks here, and I do use these notebooks quite a bit, but I am not going to use this ink on this paper. It's gross. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get a normal amount of ghosting for this paper and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Granat. Here is Diamine Claret. Here is Krishna Naval. Here is Noodler's Omaha. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine, we have no feathering, no spread, no shading, not magenta, looking red. So it's really making me say that perhaps some of the cheaper papers are altering the way we're seeing some of the color. That's how I can say it best. It might be some reaction. I don't know. The medium is a tad bit darker than the fine with no feathering. I take that back. I see a little bit of feathering on the word the, but I really don't see feathering anywhere else. So if there is, it's tiny and kind of unimportant. No shading, no spread. The broad is much darker than the medium. It does have tiny feathering all over it, but it's cheap paper. It does have a little bit of spread, but I think the spread is manageable. It has no shading whatsoever. It definitely looks red. There's definitely none of that sheen that we saw on the Clairefontaine. Now, on the back of the page, we're going to see I circled the spot on the other page. It did touch the page underneath. Now, you're going to see I circled it on the back of the other page to see which point touched. That point, I paused my nib on the paper, so it, using that capillary action, pulled it down there. It happened, but not the fault of the paper, really. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Equinox. Here's a blue-black ink by Lamy Blue Black. Here is a green ink by Monteverde, their Gemstone Olivine. Here's a turquoise ink by Sailor, their Gentle Four Seasons Yamadori. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The fine has tiny feathers, fairly consistent, but not all over it. It does have a little bit of spread, but only the tiniest bit. It has no shading whatsoever. It's still looking much more red than magenta, so if you're using this ink on cheap paper, expect more red than magenta. Medium is about the same tone as the fine, with no feather, no spread. Don't ask me how it didn't feather, and it did in the fine, but it didn't. No shading whatsoever, still red, still a color I don't care for at that point. The broad, much darker than everything else on the page. Feathering, yes, all over it, fairly consistent, but always tiny. But it is always there, and with that, a little bit of an annoyance. There's no shading whatsoever. This is why I say on the back of the last page it was more my fault than the paper. This paper had no bleeding that touched the underside of the next page. It did have plenty of ghosting, but this is cheap paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I don't care for the very dark tone found in a broad, wet pen from this ink. I like it more from a medium flow fine or medium nib to really bring out that shading. I like the character that it's bringing forward and really showing us. It makes some of the writing look a bit better. Now, based on what I'm seeing, I think this particular ink performed its best on the Clairefontaine paper. So I would say really if you want to get some of its best effects, use coated papers, not just the Clairefontaine, but anything coated ought to give you a really cool magenta and some really interesting sheen that doesn't smear a couple days after writing. Thanks for watching.